Hey everyone, tonight we begin with something that might sound like a history lesson, but trust me, it's going to be anything but boring. We're diving deep into the Aztec Empire, a civilization so intense, so demanding, and so utterly unforgiving that most of us wouldn't survive a single week, let alone thrive there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You wake up one morning, and somehow you've been transported back to the year 1500, right into the heart of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of towering pyramids or the sound of bustling markets. It's the smell, the overwhelming, inescapable scent of burning human flesh mixed with copal incense, drifting across a city of nearly 300,000 people. Welcome to your new life, assuming you can call it that. Because in the Aztec Empire, survival isn't just about finding food and shelter. It's about navigating a society so rigidly structured, so brutally efficient, and so deeply steeped in blood sacrifice that every single day is a test of your ability to simply exist. Let's start with the basics, your place in society. The moment you arrive, you're not just dropped into some generic medieval setting where you can work your way up through hard work and determination. No, in the Aztec Empire, your entire life, your opportunities, your rights, even your punishments, are determined by something you have absolutely no control over: your birth. The Aztec social hierarchy was carved in stone, as permanent and unforgiving as the pyramids themselves. At the very top sat the Huitlahuachtli, the emperor, a figure so elevated that commoners weren't even allowed to look directly at him. Below him were the nobles, the Pippleton, who lived in luxury while the rest of society toiled beneath them. Then came the priests, wielding enormous power through their connection to the gods. Warriors occupied their own special tier, earning status through captures in battle, not kills, mind you, but live prisoners destined for sacrifice. And then there's you, assuming you're not born into nobility, which statistically you wouldn't be. You're a makul, a commoner. Congratulations, you've just joined the vast majority of Aztec society, the people who do all the work, pay all the taxes, and receive none of the benefits. Your life is predetermined from the moment you draw breath. You'll work the land, you'll pay tribute, you'll send your sons to war, and you'll do it all while knowing that no amount of effort, intelligence, or skill will ever elevate you beyond your station. Social mobility? The concept barely existed. The only way a commoner could rise in status was through extraordinary military achievement, specifically by capturing enemies in battle. But even then, you're talking about a minuscule percentage of the population. For everyone else, you're born a farmer, you die a farmer. Born a craftsman, die a craftsman. The system wasn't designed to reward merit or hard work. It was designed to maintain order through rigid control. But let's say, hypothetically, you manage to accept your place in this hierarchy. Surely you can just keep your head down, work hard, and live a quiet life, right? Wrong. Because in the Aztec Empire, keeping your head down means quite literally keeping it attached to your shoulders. The legal system wasn't just harsh, it was absolutely terrifying in its brutality. We're talking about a society where theft, even minor theft, was often punishable by death, where adultery could get you stoned, strangled, or burned alive, where being drunk in public, unless you were over 70 years old, could result in your head being shaved and your house demolished. Public drunkenness was seen as such a serious offense that repeat offenders were simply executed. And if you think the punishments for adults were severe, wait until you hear about how they treated children. Aztec child-rearing practices would make modern helicopter parents faint and Child Protective Services file for emergency intervention. Children as young as 12 could face serious legal consequences for misbehavior, but long before they reached that age, Aztec parents employed what can only be described as systematic torture to ensure obedience. We're not talking about timeouts or having privileges revoked. We're talking about children being held over fires of smoking chili peppers, forced to inhale the burning smoke until they couldn't breathe. We're talking about children being pierced with maguey thorns, the sharp spikes of agave plants, driven through their arms, necks, and hips while they were bound hand and foot. The Codex Mendoza, one of our best sources for understanding Aztec daily life, shows these punishments in graphic detail. Children are depicted weeping profusely as they're threatened with thorns, as their skin is pierced, as they're beaten with sticks. The goal wasn't just discipline, it was the complete destruction of any will to resist, the creation of absolute obedience through terror and pain. Modern parents worry about being too strict when they take away a cell phone. Aztec parents worried their children weren't crying hard enough while being tortured with cactus spines. This wasn't considered abuse. This was considered proper parenting. The Aztecs believed that children needed to be broken, like horses, before they could be useful members of society. And it wasn't just physical punishment. Children of nobles faced even harsher consequences. They could be sentenced to death for being disrespectful, cowardly, or wasteful. Imagine being executed as a teenager because you didn't show proper reverence to your parents or because you were considered too lazy. The pressure on these children must have been unimaginable. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic preparation for a society built on violence, because every male child in the Aztec Empire, with the exception of those destined for the priesthood, was being trained for one primary purpose: war. Not just any war, but a particular kind of warfare that would seem insane to modern sensibilities. Warfare designed not to kill enemies, but to capture them alive so they could be dragged back to Tenochtitlan and sacrificed to the gods. Let me paint you a picture of what military training looked like for Aztec boys. From the moment they could walk, they were enrolled in schools called Telpochcali, where education meant learning to march, learning to fight, and learning to endure pain without flinching. Physical exercise wasn't about staying healthy or building character. It was about creating machines capable of capturing human beings for ritual murder. By age 15, boys were formally inducted into military training compounds where they learned not just how to use weapons, but how to use them specifically to wound and subdue rather than kill. This is crucial to understand. Aztec warfare wasn't about defeating enemies, in the way we think of military conflict. It was about harvesting human beings. The primary weapon was the macahuitl, a wooden club embedded with obsidian blades, so sharp they could decapitate a horse with a single swing. But warriors were trained to use these devastating weapons with restraint, to injure and capture rather than kill outright, because a dead enemy was useless. A living enemy could be marched back to the capital, where their still beating heart could be torn from their chest atop a pyramid while thousands watched and cheered. Young warriors proved themselves, not by killing, but by taking their first captive. Only then were they allowed to cut off the piochtli, the distinctive lock of hair they'd worn since age 10. Only then were they considered men. But this wasn't just about personal achievement. This was about feeding a religious system that demanded constant human sacrifice on a scale that would make even the most bloodthirsty tyrants of history pause in horror. The Aztecs didn't just practice human sacrifice, they industrialized it. They turned it into a massive coordinated system that required a steady supply of victims. Conservative estimates suggest that around 250,000 people were sacrificed annually in the Aztec Empire. That's not a typo. 250,000 human beings, their hearts torn out, their bodies flayed, their skulls added to massive racks that dominated the center of Tenochtitlan. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 1% of the entire population being killed every single year in religious ceremonies. And this wasn't hidden away in secret temples. This was public spectacle. The Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, was designed as a theater of death. Victims were dragged up the steep stone steps while crowds gathered below. Priests, their bodies painted black and their hair matted with blood, used obsidian knives sharper than modern surgical steel to slice open chests and tear out still beating hearts. The hearts were offered to the gods while the bodies were thrown down the pyramid steps, where they would be collected, flayed, and dismembered. But even that wasn't the end. The skulls were carefully prepared, carved with holes, and mounted on massive wooden racks called tzompantli. These skull racks weren't just religious monuments, they were psychological warfare. Spanish conquistadors reported seeing thousands upon thousands of skulls displayed in perfect rows, a visceral reminder of the price of defying Aztec power. The smell of death hung over the city like a permanent fog, a mixture of decomposing flesh, burning hearts, and the copal incense used to mask the stench. Now, you might think, surely this was limited to prisoners of war, to enemies of the state. Surely ordinary citizens were safe from this horror. But you'd be wrong. The Aztecs had a solution for when there weren't enough war captives to meet their sacrificial needs. They invented something called the Flower Wars, Xochimilquistli, which might sound beautiful, but were actually among the most cynical and terrifying practices in human history. Flower wars weren't real wars in any conventional sense. They were ritualized battles, fought solely to capture victims for sacrifice. The Aztecs would make agreements with neighboring city-states to meet at predetermined times and places for ceremonial combat. Both sides would show up with their warriors, but the goal wasn't conquest or territorial gain. The goal was to capture as many enemies as possible while allowing them to capture some of your people in return. It was a mutual human trafficking arrangement disguised as warfare, a way to ensure that both sides had a steady supply of people to murder in religious ceremonies. Think about the psychological impact of this system. Every male in Aztec society knew that they would eventually face combat. They knew that the purpose of that combat wasn't to defend their homeland or defeat their enemies, but to capture human beings for sacrifice. They also knew that they themselves might be captured, dragged to an enemy city, and have their hearts cut out while they were still alive. This wasn't an abstract possibility. This was a central feature of their society, as regular and predictable as the changing seasons. And it wasn't just warfare that fed the sacrificial machine. The Aztecs had developed dozens of different methods of ritual murder, each one more horrifying than the last. Heart extraction was just the most common. There was also death by flaying, where victims were skinned alive, and priests would wear their skin as ceremonial garments. There was death by fire, where victims were repeatedly thrown into flames and pulled out just before they died, their hearts finally removed while they were still conscious. There was death by arrows, where victims were tied to frames and shot full of darts in a grotesque parody of target practice. One of the most horrifying was the sacrifice to Xiuhtecutli, the fire god. Victims would be drugged with hallucinogens, then thrown into a bonfire. But they wouldn't be allowed to die from the flames. Instead, they would be pulled out while still alive, their charred bodies writhing in agony, and then their hearts would be cut out while they were still breathing. The Aztecs believed that if these fires didn't burn properly, if the victims didn't suffer enough, the world would end. So they made sure the suffering was as intense and prolonged as possible. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Aztec sacrifice was how it was woven into every aspect of daily life. These weren't rare, exceptional events. They were constant, regular occurrences that shaped the rhythm of the calendar. Every major festival required human sacrifice. Every important religious ceremony demanded blood. Every significant political event was marked by the ritual murder of human beings. Children grew up watching people being killed. They played in plazas where the stones were permanently stained with blood. They went to school past skull racks, displaying the heads of thousands of sacrifice victims. They learned to read using codices that depicted the proper methods for cutting out human hearts. This wasn't something that happened to other people in distant places. This was the fabric of their society, as normal and unremarkable as going to church is for modern Americans. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. The Aztecs weren't primitive savages acting on blind impulse. They were a sophisticated, highly organized civilization with advanced mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and engineering. They built floating gardens that were marvels of agricultural innovation. They constructed causeways and aqueducts that supplied clean water to a city larger than any in Europe. They developed a calendar more accurate than the one used by their Spanish conquerors. They were intelligent, thoughtful, creative people who had consciously chosen to build their entire society around the systematic torture and murder of human beings. This wasn't ignorance or barbarism. This was a deliberate decision made by a highly advanced civilization. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway on a scale that defies comprehension. The Spanish, who were hardly squeamish about violence themselves, were horrified by what they found in Tenochtitlan. These were men who had fought in European wars, who had witnessed the brutality of the Inquisition, who had seen cities sacked and populations enslaved. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for the industrialized human sacrifice of the Aztec Empire. And this brings us to perhaps the most important point about why you wouldn't last a day in Aztec society. It's not just that you'd be horrified by the violence, though you would be. It's not just that you'd be crushed by the rigid social hierarchy, though you would be. It's that you'd be living in a society where the fundamental assumptions about human life, about the purpose of existence, about what it means to be a person, were completely different from anything you've ever known. In our society, we believe that human life has intrinsic value, that people deserve to be treated with dignity, that suffering should be minimized when possible. The Aztecs believed that human life was raw material for the gods, that suffering was not only acceptable, but necessary, that the highest purpose a person could serve was to die screaming on an altar while their heart was torn from their chest. These aren't just different values, they're incompatible worldviews, and trying to navigate a society built on principles that violate everything you believe about human nature would drive most people to madness. But we're just getting started, because the violence, as horrifying as it was only one aspect of what made Aztec society so challenging for modern people to survive in. The daily life of an ordinary Aztec citizen was a grinding routine of backbreaking labor, constant surveillance, and crushing economic pressure that would make the most demanding modern job seem like a vacation. Every aspect of your existence was monitored, controlled, and taxed by a bureaucratic machine that made modern governments look positively libertarian. You think you pay a lot in taxes now? Try living in a society where the tribute system was designed to extract every possible resource from every household, leaving families with just enough to survive and nothing more. The tribute obligations weren't just financial burdens, they were existential threats. Every household was required to contribute specific goods to the empire: cloth, food, precious stones, crafted items, and the quantities weren't negotiable. Failed to meet your quota? Congratulations. You and your family just became slaves. That's not hyperbole. Failure to pay tribute was legally punishable through enslavement or the complete confiscation of everything you owned. Imagine losing your home, your freedom, and your children's future because you couldn't weave enough cotton cloth or grow enough maize to satisfy distant bureaucrats you'd never meet. But here's what makes it even more crushing. You weren't just paying tribute to support some distant emperor's luxury. You were funding your own oppression. Your cotton was being turned into ceremonial garments for priests who would use them while cutting out human hearts. Your food was feeding warriors whose job was to capture more people for sacrifice. Your labor was supporting a system designed to terrorize and control you. Every thread you wove, every kernel of corn you grew, every precious stone you polished was another brick in the prison that held your entire civilization captive. And it wasn't just about meeting quotas. The quality had to be perfect. Aztec inspectors would examine every piece of tribute, every textile, every food item, looking for defects. Substandard work didn't just mean rejection, it meant punishment, public humiliation, additional tribute obligations, sometimes physical beatings administered by local officials who were themselves terrified of failing to meet their own quotas to the empire above them. The entire system was built on fear cascading down from the emperor to the lowest peasant, each level terrorizing the one below it to ensure compliance. The work itself was brutal beyond anything most modern people have experienced. Forget about 8-hour workdays or weekends off. In the Aztec Empire, every day was a workday, and every hour of daylight was expected to be productive. Men worked the fields using tools that hadn't changed in centuries, wooden digging sticks and stone hoes that required enormous physical effort to accomplish even basic agricultural tasks. The Chinampas, those famous floating gardens that we're taught to admire as marvels of engineering, were actually back-breaking death traps where farmers worked in swampy conditions, standing knee-deep in water and mud, their backs bent for hours at a time, planting and harvesting crops while fighting off insects, disease, and the constant threat of drowning. Women weren't spared from this grinding labor. Every Aztec woman, from the lowest slave to the highest noblewoman, was required to spin and weave cloth. This wasn't a hobby or a way to pass time. This was industrial production carried out in individual households, a distributed factory system that turned every home into a textile manufacturing center. Women's hands were permanently stained from dyes, their fingers cracked and bleeding from handling rough fibers, their backs bent from hunching over looms for 12 to 14 hours a day. They spun thread while cooking, wove cloth while watching children, dyed fabric while cleaning house. There was no separation between work and life because every moment was work. And children, they started contributing to household production as soon as they could hold a spindle or carry water. 5-year-olds were expected to help with basic tasks. By age 8, they were integral parts of the family's economic survival. By 12, they were working nearly adult hours while still receiving their education, which, remember, was primarily focused on preparing them for warfare and their predetermined social roles. Childhood, as we understand it, a time of play and exploration and gradual learning, simply didn't exist. The physical toll of this constant labor was devastating. Archaeological evidence shows that Aztec commoners suffered from severe arthritis, spinal compression, and joint deterioration by their 20s. Their bones tell a story of bodies worn out by relentless physical stress, of people who aged decades in the span of years. The average life expectancy was brutally short, not just because of disease and violence, but because the simple act of surviving required such intense physical exertion that human bodies couldn't sustain it for long. But even if you could somehow adapt to the physical demands, even if you could force your soft, modern body to endure the constant labor and pain, you still wouldn't be safe, because the Aztec Empire was a society perpetually at war, not just with external enemies, but with disease, with famine, with the basic challenge of keeping hundreds of thousands of people alive in a pre-industrial urban environment. Tenochtitlan was one of the largest cities in the world, with nearly 300,000 inhabitants crammed onto an island in the middle of a lake. The engineering required to supply fresh water, remove waste, and distribute food to this massive population was impressive, but it was also fragile. When things went wrong, they went catastrophically wrong. Disease outbreaks could kill thousands in a matter of weeks. Crop failures could lead to famine that lasted for years. Even minor disruptions to the supply chains that kept the city functioning could trigger social collapse. And diseases were a constant threat, even before Europeans arrived with their devastating epidemics. The population density of Tenochtitlan created perfect conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. Families lived in single-room houses with multiple generations crammed together. Markets brought thousands of people into close contact daily. The waste management system, impressive as it was, still meant that human excrement was being collected in canoes and transported through the city's waterways. One contaminated water source, one sick market vendor, one infected household, and disease could spread through entire neighborhoods in days. The Aztecs had no concept of germ theory, no understanding of how diseases spread, no effective treatments for most illnesses. Their medicine was a mixture of herbal remedies, ritual purification, and prayer, which meant that even treatable conditions often became fatal. A simple infection could kill you. Diarrhea could kill you. A fever could kill you. Childbirth was essentially a death lottery for women, with no understanding of sterile procedures or emergency interventions. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the psychological pressure of living in a society where violence could erupt at any moment, where the wrong word, the wrong gesture, the wrong association could mark you for punishment or death. The Aztec legal system wasn't just harsh in its punishments, it was arbitrary in its enforcement. Accusations of sorcery, adultery, theft, or disrespect could come from neighbors, rivals, even family members, and once accused, you were essentially guilty until proven innocent, which was nearly impossible. The courts didn't operate on evidence or due process as we understand them. They operated on social hierarchy, personal connections, and the political needs of the moment. A noble's word against a commoner's wasn't just more credible, it was essentially unquestionable. If a priest accused you of impiety, if a warrior accused you of cowardice, if a local official accused you of tax evasion, your fate was sealed. The investigation would be perfunctory, the trial brief, and the punishment swift and brutal. This created an atmosphere of constant paranoia, where everyone was watching everyone else, looking for signs of disloyalty, deviance, or weakness that could be exploited. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Children reported their parents' private conversations. Spouses denounced each other to avoid being implicated in each other's crimes. Trust became a luxury that most people couldn't afford, because trusting the wrong person could literally cost you your life. And remember, this was all happening in a society where the central government's primary function was organizing the mass murder of human beings. Every major decision, every policy, every law was ultimately designed to serve the needs of the sacrificial system. Roads were built to transport captives to temples. Granaries were stocked to feed the crowds that came to watch executions. Schools taught children to accept and participate in ritualized killing. The entire civilization was organized around death, and everyone living in it was complicit, whether they wanted to be or not. You couldn't opt out. You couldn't be a conscientious objector. You couldn't move to a different city or find a different job or practice a different religion. Your participation in the system wasn't voluntary. It was mandatory, enforced by social pressure, legal requirement, and the ever-present threat of becoming a sacrifice victim yourself if you refused to cooperate. The Aztecs had created a totalitarian state centuries before the term was invented, a society where every aspect of human life was controlled by institutions dedicated to systematic murder. And here's what makes it even more psychologically devastating. It worked. The system was stable, successful, and expanding when the Spanish arrived. The Aztec Empire controlled millions of people across hundreds of thousands of square miles. Their cities were clean, their agriculture productive, their crafts sophisticated, their military undefeated. By every measure that civilizations use to judge themselves, they were thriving, which means that the mass murder, the oppression, the terror weren't bugs in the system. They were features. They were what made it work. This challenges every assumption we have about human nature and social progress. We like to believe that societies naturally evolve toward greater freedom, greater respect for human rights, greater recognition of individual dignity. The Aztec Empire is proof that this isn't true. A highly advanced, sophisticated, successful civilization can be built on principles that we consider fundamentally evil, and not only can it survive, it can prosper for centuries. Living in such a society wouldn't just be physically difficult or emotionally traumatic. It would force you to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature, to recognize that the values you consider universal and self-evident are actually recent, fragile, and far from inevitable. It would show you that civilization and barbarism aren't opposites, but can be intimately connected, that the same intelligence and creativity that builds beautiful cities and develops advanced technologies can also devise increasingly efficient methods of torture and murder. The Aztec Empire represents one of humanity's greatest achievements and one of its greatest horrors, and they're the same thing. The engineering marvels that supplied fresh water to Tenochtitlan also supplied fresh blood to its altars. The organizational genius that coordinated tribute from millions of subjects also coordinated their systematic terrorization. The artistic brilliance that created magnificent sculptures and codices also created increasingly elaborate methods of human sacrifice. You wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire, not because you're weak or unprepared, but because you're human, because you retain enough basic human decency to be horrified by what you'd see, enough moral instinct to recognize evil when it's presented as virtue, enough psychological health to be traumatized by daily exposure to industrialized murder. Your inability to survive in their world isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's proof that despite all our problems, despite all our flaws, we've managed to build societies based on fundamentally different and better principles. But the story doesn't end with violence and oppression, because the Aztecs also had to deal with forces beyond their control, natural disasters, and diseases that could wipe out entire populations, regardless of how well organized or militarily powerful they were. And when these forces finally arrived in the form of European diseases, they revealed just how fragile even the mightiest empire could be. The Cocolizli epidemics that swept through the Aztec Empire were unlike anything modern people have experienced, and they reveal just how precarious life was, even in the most advanced and pre-Columbian civilization. Picture this. You wake up feeling perfectly fine, go about your daily routine of tribute work and ritual obligations, and by evening you're burning with fever so intense that your skin feels like it's on fire. By the third day, you're bleeding from your eyes, nose, and mouth. Black pustules cover your tongue. Your urine has turned dark as obsidian, and by the end of the week, if you're unlucky enough to last that long, you're dead. This wasn't a gradual decline. This was rapid, terrifying deterioration that could take you from healthy to corpse in less time than it takes a modern cold to run its course. The disease hit without warning, without obvious cause, and without mercy. Entire families would be wiped out in days. Neighborhoods would go silent as house after house fell victim to the pestilence. The smell of death, already a constant presence from the sacrificial temples, became overwhelming as bodies piled up faster than they could be disposed of. But here's what makes it even more terrifying from a modern perspective. The Aztecs had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. They didn't know about viruses or bacteria or transmission vectors. To them, disease was either supernatural punishment or the result of moral failing. So when entire communities started dying, the response wasn't medical intervention. It was increased human sacrifice, more hearts torn out, more blood spilled, more desperate attempts to appease gods who seemed determined to destroy their people. Imagine being trapped in that mindset. Your children are dying. Your neighbors are dying. You can feel the fever starting to burn in your own veins. And the official response from your government is to kill more people on the altars. The priests would drag weakened plague victims up the pyramid steps, arguing that the gods demanded even greater sacrifice to end the pestilence. The very people who should have been caring for the sick were instead cutting out their hearts while they were still breathing, and it wasn't just the mysterious Kokolistli that terrorized the population. Even before European contact, the dense urban environment of Tenochtitlan was a breeding ground for infectious diseases. With nearly 300,000 people crammed onto an island, sharing water sources, trading in crowded markets, and living in multi-generational households where privacy was impossible, disease spread with terrifying efficiency. The morning routine for an average Aztec family would expose them to more potential sources of infection than most modern people encounter in a month. You'd wake up in a single room shared with parents, grandparents, children, and possibly extended family members. No separate bedrooms, no personal space, just bodies pressed together for warmth and security. If one person brought home an illness, everyone was exposed immediately. Then you'd head to the communal latrines, shared facilities used by hundreds of people with no understanding of sanitation beyond basic waste removal. The Aztecs were actually quite advanced in their waste management systems, collecting human excrement in canoes and using it as fertilizer for their chinampas. But from a disease transmission standpoint, this meant that infected waste was being transported throughout the city's waterways, creating multiple opportunities for contamination. Next, you'd visit the markets, massive gatherings where thousands of people from across the empire came to trade goods. Merchants from the coast brought fish and shells. Traders from the mountains brought obsidian and precious stones. Farmers from the Chinampas brought fresh vegetables and flowers. And with them, they brought whatever diseases were circulating in their home regions. The market wasn't just a place of commerce. It was a mixing bowl for every pathogen in Mesoamerica. The food itself was another source of constant risk. Without refrigeration or proper preservation techniques, spoilage was common and often undetectable until it was too late. Meat had to be consumed quickly or dried, but the drying process wasn't always sufficient to kill harmful bacteria. Fish from the lake, a dietary staple, could carry parasites and waterborne diseases. Even the prized cacao beans used to make chocolate drinks could harbor mold and toxins if not properly stored. And then there was the water supply. Despite their impressive aqueduct system that brought fresh water from mountain springs, the distribution network within the city was vulnerable to contamination. Clay pipes could crack, allowing sewage to mix with drinking water. Storage vessels could become breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease vectors. The very lakes that surrounded the city, while providing fish and transportation routes, also served as dumping grounds for waste that couldn't be processed through the official collection system. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the medical treatment available when people did fall ill. Aztec medicine was sophisticated in some ways, with extensive knowledge of herbal remedies and surgical techniques, but it was also deeply intertwined with religious beliefs that often made treatment worse than the disease itself. If you developed a fever, the prescribed treatment might involve bloodletting to balance your humors, weakening your immune system when you needed it most. If you showed signs of infection, you might be given purgatives that would dehydrate you further. Mental illness was often treated as demonic possession, with remedies that involved consuming hallucinogenic substances or undergoing ritual purification that could last for days. Broken bones might be reset properly, but the lack of sterile techniques meant that infections were common complications. Childbirth, already dangerous enough, became a death sentence for many women because the midwives, despite their skill and experience, had no way to prevent or treat the infections that so often followed difficult deliveries. And if the physical diseases didn't kill you, the psychological pressure of living in constant fear of illness might drive you to madness. Every cough from a family member, every fever in a child, every unusual symptom could be the beginning of an epidemic that would wipe out everyone you loved. Sleep would become fitful and anxious as you listened for the sounds of sickness in the night. Work would be interrupted by constant worry about whether that merchant you dealt with yesterday looked a little too pale, whether that child playing in the street was developing the telltale signs of the next outbreak. The social fabric would fray as communities turned on each other, looking for someone to blame for the diseases that kept striking. Accusations of sorcery would fly. Suspected witches would be dragged before courts and executed. Healers who failed to cure patients would be condemned as frauds or devil worshippers. The very people who should have been working together to fight disease would instead be destroying each other in paranoid frenzy. But even if you somehow managed to avoid the diseases, even if your immune system proved remarkably resilient to the constant barrage of pathogens, you'd still face the grinding daily reality of simply staying fed in a society where food security was never guaranteed. The Aztec agricultural system, impressive as it was, operated on such thin margins that a single bad harvest could trigger famine across the empire. The Chinampas, those floating gardens that we're taught to admire as marvels of sustainable agriculture, were actually incredibly labor-intensive and vulnerable to environmental disruption. Building them required hauling massive amounts of mud and vegetation from the lake bottom, piling it onto wooden frames until it formed artificial islands. Maintaining them meant constant dredging, replanting, and repair work that consumed enormous amounts of human energy. And they were completely dependent on the lake's water levels remaining stable. Too much rain, and the Chinampas would flood, drowning the crops. Too little rain, and the lake would recede, leaving the gardens high and dry. The elaborate system of canals and dikes that controlled water flow required constant maintenance by teams of workers who had to wade through polluted water, fighting off leeches and water snakes while struggling to move massive stone blocks and wooden beams. The crops themselves were vulnerable to pests, diseases, and weather fluctuations that could wipe out entire harvests overnight. Maize, the dietary staple, was susceptible to fungal infections that could not only destroy the crop, but make it toxic to humans. Beans and squash could be devastated by insect infestations. The cacao trees that produced the precious chocolate beans, beloved by the elite, were temperamental plants that required specific soil conditions and climate patterns to thrive. When harvests failed, the consequences cascaded through the entire social system. Food prices would skyrocket, making basic nutrition unaffordable for common families. The tribute system would become even more crushing as local administrators demanded the same quantities of goods despite reduced agricultural output. Malnutrition would weaken the population, making them more susceptible to disease outbreaks. Social unrest would increase as hungry people became desperate enough to risk the brutal punishments for theft or rebellion, and the government's response to famine was typically to increase religious observances, including more human sacrifice. The logic was that the gods were angry and needed to be appeased with greater offerings of blood and hearts. So while people were starving, the priests would be working overtime to kill more victims, consuming resources that could have been used for famine relief. The smoke from burning human flesh would mix with the incense meant to carry prayers to the heavens, creating a grotesque atmosphere where death and worship became indistinguishable. Storage and preservation of food were constant challenges that required enormous investments of time and energy. Maize had to be dried thoroughly and stored in sealed containers to prevent rot and insect infestation. But even properly stored grain could spoil if the containers were damaged or if moisture found its way inside. Families would spend weeks preparing for the lean months, grinding corn into flour, making tortillas that could be dried and stored, preserving meat through smoking and salting processes that were labor-intensive and didn't always work. The psychological pressure of food insecurity was relentless. Every meal consumed was one less meal in storage. Every seed eaten was one less seed available for next year's planting. Parents would go hungry to feed their children, knowing that weakened adults meant reduced capacity for the labor needed to produce next year's harvest. Children would learn early that food was precious, that waste was not just forbidden, but potentially lethal, that every grain of corn represented hours of backbreaking work under the blazing sun. And this was during good years. During bad years, when the rains failed or came too early, when volcanic eruptions blocked out the sun or earthquakes disrupted the irrigation systems, the situation became desperate beyond modern comprehension. Families would be forced to sell themselves into slavery to avoid starvation. Parents would abandon children they couldn't feed. Desperate people would resort to eating anything remotely edible: tree bark, grass, leather, even clay mixed with whatever scraps of food they could find. The markets during famine periods would become scenes of desperation and exploitation. Those with stored food would demand exorbitant prices, trading precious grains for family heirlooms, tools, even sexual services. The wealthy would continue their elaborate feasts, while commoners literally starved to death in the streets outside their palaces. The social bonds that held communities together would snap under the pressure of survival, turning neighbors into competitors and families into economic units where the weak were expendable. But even during times of relative plenty, the daily process of obtaining and preparing food was exhausting and time-consuming. Women would wake before dawn to start grinding corn on stone metates, a process that could take hours and left their hands bloody and their backs aching. The grinding had to be done fresh daily because ground corn spoiled quickly in the humid climate. Water had to be carried from distant sources, often requiring multiple trips with heavy clay vessels that could shatter if dropped. Cooking was done over open fires that filled homes with smoke and required constant tending. Firewood had to be gathered, often from increasingly distant locations, as nearby forests were depleted. The hearth fires were dangerous, especially in crowded living conditions where a single spark could ignite clothing or bedding. Burns were common and often became infected, leading to disability or death. The preparation of other foods was equally labor-intensive. Cacao beans had to be roasted, ground, and mixed by hand to create the chocolate drinks enjoyed by the elite. Chili peppers had to be dried, ground, and carefully stored to maintain their potency. Salt, essential for preservation and flavor, had to be traded for or extracted from salt lakes through evaporation processes that required weeks of careful attention. And all of this food preparation had to be done while simultaneously fulfilling tribute obligations, caring for children, maintaining household goods, and participating in the endless religious ceremonies that dominated Aztec social life. There was no separation between work and domestic duties, no time off, no concept of leisure as we understand it. Every waking hour was consumed by the basic necessities of survival in a society that demanded maximum productivity from every individual. The tools available for food production and preparation were primitive by modern standards, but represented the pinnacle of Aztec technology. Stone knives that had to be constantly resharpened, clay pots that could crack or break at any moment, wooden implements that wore out quickly and had to be constantly replaced. Every tool was precious because replacing them required either significant trade negotiations or the time and skill to manufacture new ones from scratch. And the knowledge required to use these tools effectively was vast and complex. Knowing exactly when to plant different crops based on seasonal patterns and soil conditions. Understanding which combinations of foods provided adequate nutrition. Mastering the intricate processes needed to transform raw materials into edible meals. This knowledge was passed down through generations, but it was fragile. If experienced cooks or farmers died in epidemics or wars, entire communities could lose crucial survival skills. The seasonal cycles that governed food production also controlled every other aspect of life. Planting season meant long days in the fields, bent over under the scorching sun, fighting off insects and birds while carefully placing each seed in soil that had been prepared through weeks of backbreaking labor. Harvest season meant race against time and weather, working frantically to gather crops before rains could rot them or animals could destroy them. But perhaps most psychologically demanding was the constant uncertainty. Modern people take food security for granted. We assume that grocery stores will be stocked, that supply chains will function, that someone else is handling the complex logistics of feeding large populations. Aztec families lived with the knowledge that their next meal depended entirely on their own efforts, on weather patterns beyond their control, on political decisions made by rulers they'd never meet, on the whims of gods who seemed to delight in human suffering. This uncertainty permeated every decision. Should you eat the stored corn now or save it for later? Should you trade your surplus beans for obsidian tools or keep them as insurance against future shortages? Should you plant the same crops that worked last year or try something new that might yield better results but could also fail completely? Every choice carried potentially lethal consequences, and there was no safety net, no government assistance, no insurance to fall back on if you chose wrong. The psychological toll of this constant pressure was immense. Sleep would be fitful as you worried about tomorrow's work, next season's harvest, next year's tribute obligations. Anxiety would be a constant companion as you calculated and recalculated whether your family had enough resources to survive the coming months. Depression would be common as people faced the reality that no matter how hard they worked, their children would likely face the same grinding poverty and uncertainty. And underlying all of this daily struggle for survival was the ever-present knowledge that your society's ultimate purpose was death, that all the corn you grew, all the cloth you wove, all the tribute you paid was ultimately funding a system designed to kill human beings by the thousands, that your sons were being trained not to build or create or discover, but to capture other human beings so their hearts could be torn out on altars, that your daughters were learning not just to cook and clean and weave, but to accept a world where ritual murder was the highest form of religious expression. Living with that knowledge, working every day to support a system built on systematic terror, would crush the spirit of anyone with basic human decency. The cognitive dissonance of participating in daily life, while knowing that your participation enabled mass murder, would be psychologically devastating. You'd be complicit in atrocities while simultaneously being their potential victim, supporting a system that could decide at any moment that your heart needed to be offered to the gods. This is why you wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire, not because of any single aspect of their society, but because of how all these elements combined to create a perfect storm of physical hardship, psychological trauma, and moral horror that would overwhelm anyone with modern sensibilities. The violence, the disease, the hunger, the exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty, the complicity in evil, all layered on top of each other until life became an endurance test that few could survive with their sanity intact. But there's one more element we haven't fully explored yet, one that might be the most alien of all to modern people: the complete absence of individual privacy, personal autonomy, or the right to make your own choices about anything that mattered. In the Aztec Empire, your life belonged not to you, but to the state, to your family, to your Calpulli or neighborhood group, to the gods themselves. The very concept of individual rights, of personal freedom, of the pursuit of happiness as we understand it, simply didn't exist. From the moment you opened your eyes as an Aztec citizen, every aspect of your existence was predetermined, monitored, and controlled by forces beyond your comprehension or influence. You think modern surveillance states are oppressive? Try living in a society where your neighbors, your family members, even your own children were expected to report your private conversations, your facial expressions, your tone of voice when discussing the government or the gods. The Calpulli system that organized Aztec neighborhoods wasn't just administrative convenience. It was a surveillance network that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. Every family was assigned to a specific Calpulli, and every Calpulli had designated officials whose job was to monitor the loyalty, productivity, and moral behavior of every resident. These weren't distant bureaucrats filing reports in some government office. These were your neighbors, people who lived next door, who knew your children's names, who could observe your daily routines and report any deviation from expected behavior. Privacy, as we understand it, was literally impossible. Homes were single-room structures where entire extended families lived together. There were no separate bedrooms, no private spaces, no moments when you could be alone with your thoughts. Every conversation was overheard. Every emotion was observed. Every personal struggle was community knowledge. If you were having doubts about the sacrificial system, if you were questioning the tribute demands, if you were simply having a bad day and showed insufficient enthusiasm for your assigned tasks, someone would notice, and someone would report it. The psychological pressure of living under constant observation was crushing. You couldn't relax, couldn't let your guard down, couldn't express genuine emotions if they conflicted with social expectations. Every smile had to be measured, every word carefully chosen, every gesture calculated to avoid suspicion. Imagine never being able to complain, never being able to voice frustration, never being able to question why things were the way they were. Imagine living your entire life performing a role, terrified that a single moment of authenticity might mark you as a dangerous deviant. And it wasn't just social surveillance. The Aztec calendar system meant that every day, every hour, almost every moment was assigned religious significance that dictated appropriate behavior. There were lucky days and unlucky days, days when certain activities were forbidden, days when specific rituals were mandatory. Your personal preferences, your individual needs, your family emergencies, none of that mattered if the calendar said today was a day for fasting or temple attendance or community labor projects. The Tonopohualli, the 260-day ritual calendar, divided time into periods governed by different gods with different requirements. If you were born on a day ruled by a particular deity, your entire personality, your career prospects, your marriage compatibility, even your likely cause of death were considered predetermined. Free will wasn't just discouraged, it was considered impossible. The gods had already decided your fate, and attempting to change it was both futile and blasphemous. This fatalistic worldview permeated every decision, every relationship, every moment of daily life. Why try to improve your situation if the gods had already decided you were meant to be poor? Why resist an arranged marriage if the calendar indicated compatibility? Why question your assigned role in society if divine forces had predetermined your place in the cosmic order? The system didn't just control your actions, it controlled your ability to imagine alternatives. Education reinforced this psychological control from the earliest possible age. Children weren't taught to think critically, to question authority, or to develop their individual talents and interests. They were taught to memorize, to obey, to accept their predetermined roles without complaint. The Telpachkali schools that most children attended were designed to produce compliant workers and soldiers, not independent thinkers or creative innovators. Even the games children played reinforced social hierarchies and religious obligations. Tlachtli, the famous ball game, wasn't just entertainment. It was ritualized combat, where the losers were often sacrificed to the gods. Children learned early that competition wasn't about personal achievement or fun, but about life and death stakes, where failure could be literally fatal. Play itself became another form of training for a society built on violence and submission. The marriage system eliminated any possibility of romantic choice or personal compatibility. Marriages were arranged by families based on economic considerations, social status, and calendar compatibility. Love was irrelevant. Personal attraction was irrelevant. Individual preferences were not just ignored, they were considered dangerous disruptions to social order. Young people had no say in who they would spend their lives with, how many children they would have, or where they would live. Once married, the restrictions became even more suffocating. Husbands had absolute authority over their wives and children. Women couldn't own property, couldn't make financial decisions, couldn't travel without permission, couldn't even speak in public gatherings without risking punishment for inappropriate behavior. Their entire existence was defined by their relationships to men, first as daughters under their father's control, then as wives under their husband's control, finally as widows under their eldest son's control. But men weren't free either. They were trapped in their own set of rigid expectations and obligations. They had to provide for extended families, meet tribute obligations, serve in the military, participate in religious ceremonies, all while maintaining the appearance of strength and competence, regardless of their personal struggles or limitations. Showing weakness, expressing doubt, admitting fear, any sign of human vulnerability could result in social ostracism or worse. The economic system reinforced this control through debt bondage and hereditary obligations that could trap families in cycles of poverty for generations. If your father owed tribute so he couldn't pay, you inherited that debt. If your grandfather had been assigned to a particular craft specialization, you were expected to continue that trade, regardless of your interests or aptitudes. Social mobility wasn't just difficult, it was actively discouraged as a disruption to divine order. The tribute system itself was designed to keep families operating at subsistence level with just enough resources to survive, but never enough to accumulate wealth or independence. Every surplus was extracted by the state, leaving no cushion for emergencies, no opportunity to invest in improvements, no possibility of building a better life for your children. You worked not to prosper, but to avoid punishment. You produced not to benefit your family, but to feed a system that viewed you as expendable, and the religious obligations were relentless. Daily prayers, weekly ceremonies, monthly festivals, annual celebrations, all requiring specific preparations, specific behaviors, specific offerings. There were gods for every activity, every location, every time of day. The morning required prayers to the sun god. Evening required prayers to the night gods. Travel required prayers to road gods. Work required prayers to craft gods. Every action had to be sanctified. Every decision had to be justified in religious terms. The priests who enforced these obligations weren't benevolent spiritual guides. They were political enforcers whose primary job was maintaining social control through fear and intimidation. They could declare anyone ritually impure, socially dangerous, or spiritually corrupted based on the flimsiest evidence or no evidence at all. Their word was law. Their interpretations of divine will were unquestionable. Their demands for offerings and services were unlimited. But perhaps most psychologically devastating was the complete absence of hope for change or improvement. Modern people, even in difficult circumstances, can imagine better futures, can work toward goals, can believe that effort and intelligence and determination might lead to progress. Aztec commoners lived in a world where change was not just impossible, but forbidden. The social order was divinely ordained. The tribute system was religiously mandated. The sacrificial requirements were cosmically necessary. Questioning any aspect of the system wasn't just politically dangerous, it was spiritually blasphemous, suggesting that perhaps fewer people needed to be sacrificed, that perhaps tribute obligations were too heavy, that perhaps individuals should have some choice in their careers or marriages. These weren't political opinions. These were attacks on the fundamental structure of reality itself. The gods had created the world this way, and humans who thought they knew better were not just wrong, they were evil. This created a form of learned helplessness that would be familiar to psychologists studying totalitarian societies. People stopped even thinking about alternatives because imagining change was too painful when change was impossible. They accepted suffering as inevitable, injustice as divine will, oppression as natural law. The human capacity for hope, for dreams, for aspiration was systematically crushed until most people couldn't even conceive of life being different. The few who did maintain some spark of independent thought, some desire for change, some refusal to accept the system's demands, were quickly identified and eliminated. Not just killed, though that was common enough, but psychologically destroyed through public humiliation, social isolation, and ritualized torture designed to break their spirits before breaking their bodies. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile, it was literally unthinkable. Living under such comprehensive control would drive most modern people to complete psychological breakdown within days. We're accustomed to making countless small choices throughout our day, from what to eat for breakfast, to what route to take to work, to what entertainment to consume in the evening. The sudden removal of all choice, all autonomy, all personal agency would be like psychological suffocation. But it wouldn't just be the loss of freedom that would destroy you. It would be the gradual realization that this wasn't temporary, wasn't something you could endure until conditions improved. This was permanent. This was life. This was how human beings were meant to exist, according to the most successful civilization in Mesoamerica. The horror wouldn't fade with familiarity. It would compound with each passing day as you understood more deeply just how completely trapped you were. And trapped is exactly the right word, because escape wasn't just difficult or dangerous, it was literally impossible. Where would you go? Every neighboring society operated under similar principles. The entire region was controlled by city-states that shared the same basic worldview, the same social structures, the same religious obligations. Running away meant abandoning your family to punishment for your desertion, assuming you could somehow survive in the wilderness without the support systems that kept urban populations alive. The Aztec Empire had created what modern scholars call a totalizing system, one that controlled every aspect of human existence so completely that alternatives became literally unimaginable, not just practically impossible, but conceptually inconceivable. The vocabulary didn't exist for individual rights, personal freedom, or social criticism. The mental categories that would allow people to think such thoughts had been systematically eliminated from the culture. This is perhaps the most alien aspect of Aztec society for modern people to understand. We live in a world where dissent is not just tolerated, but celebrated, where questioning authority is considered a civic duty, where individual expression is seen as fundamental to human dignity. The idea of a society that successfully eliminated these concepts, that created human beings who literally couldn't think rebellious thoughts, challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature and social organization. Yet that's exactly what the Aztecs achieved. They created a stable, prosperous, expanding empire by turning human beings into components in a vast machine designed to produce tribute, soldiers, and sacrifice victims. The machine worked precisely because its components couldn't imagine being anything other than components. They had been so thoroughly conditioned, so completely controlled, so systematically broken that they participated enthusiastically in their own oppression. The psychological techniques used to achieve this level of control were sophisticated and terrifyingly effective. From birth, children were subjected to conditioning that associated obedience with survival, questioning with death, conformity with virtue, and individual expression with evil. Pain and pleasure, reward and punishment, hope and fear were all carefully calibrated to produce human beings who not only obeyed orders, but genuinely believed that obedience was the highest form of morality. The result was a population that policed itself, that required minimal external coercion because internal controls were so complete. People didn't rebel because they couldn't conceive of rebellion. They didn't resist because resistance wasn't part of their mental vocabulary. They didn't question because they had been trained to see questioning as a form of mental illness that required the treatment through ritual purification or elimination. This level of psychological control would be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern studies of cult indoctrination, totalitarian brainwashing, or extreme religious fundamentalism. But the Aztecs achieved it on a civilizational scale, across millions of people, for centuries. They created a society-wide cult where the leaders were gods, the doctrine was sacrifice, and the punishment for apostasy was having your heart torn out while you were still alive. Understanding this helps explain why Spanish conquest was possible despite the Aztecs' military superiority and numerical advantage. It wasn't just disease and horses and steel weapons that defeated them. It was the fact that their entire social system was designed to produce obedient followers, not independent leaders. When the top of the hierarchy was removed, the rest of the system collapsed because no one had been trained to think for themselves, to adapt to new circumstances, to question orders from authority figures. The conquistadors, for all their brutality and greed, came from a society that at least allowed for some degree of individual initiative, some questioning of authority, some adaptation to changing circumstances. They were still operating within hierarchical systems, but those systems weren't totalizing in the way Aztec society was. Spanish soldiers could make tactical decisions, could adapt their strategies, could even disobey orders when circumstances required it. Aztec warriors, despite their skill and courage, were operating within much more rigid mental frameworks. They had been trained to follow predetermined patterns, to fulfill assigned roles, to trust that their superiors understood the cosmic significance of their actions. When those patterns broke down, when their superiors were killed or captured, when the cosmic order itself seemed to be collapsing, they lacked the psychological flexibility to respond effectively. This isn't meant to diminish their achievements or excuse Spanish atrocities. The Aztecs created remarkable works of art, architecture, and engineering. They developed sophisticated mathematical and astronomical knowledge. They built a complex urban civilization that supported hundreds of thousands of people. But they did it all within a framework that systematically eliminated the human qualities that modern people consider most precious: freedom, creativity, individual dignity, and the right to pursue happiness. You wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire because you're not just a product of a different time and place. You're a product of fundamentally different ideas about what human beings are and what they deserve. Ideas that took centuries to develop, that were fought for and died for by countless people who refused to accept that obedience and suffering were the natural human condition. The Aztec Empire represents what happens when intelligence and creativity are turned toward the perfection of human control rather than human liberation. It shows us that civilization and oppression aren't opposites, but can be intimately connected, that the same organizational genius that creates beautiful cities can also create beautiful systems of human degradation. It reminds us that the values we take for granted, the freedoms we assume are natural, the dignity we believe is inherent, are actually recent, fragile achievements that require constant defense against forces that would reduce human beings to components in vast machines of power and profit. That's why studying the Aztec Empire is both fascinating and terrifying. It shows us possibilities we'd rather not contemplate, human potential we'd rather not acknowledge, alternatives to our way of life that are both completely alien and disturbingly familiar, because the techniques they used to control their population, the methods they employed to eliminate dissent, the systems they created to harvest human resources, aren't really that different from methods still being employed around the world today. The scale was different, the technology was different, the specific ideological justifications were different, but the underlying logic of turning human beings into instruments of power, of eliminating individual agency in service of collective goals, of using fear and pain and ritual to maintain social control, these patterns repeat throughout history with depressing regularity. The Aztec Empire succeeded because it understood something that many modern people prefer to forget: that human beings can be conditioned to accept almost anything if the conditioning is thorough enough, if the alternatives are eliminated completely, if the pain of resistance is made greater than the pain of submission. They created a society where the victims of oppression became its most enthusiastic supporters, where the people being exploited competed to be exploited more thoroughly, where the potential sacrifices volunteered for the altars. This is what makes their civilization so alien and so relevant. Alien because we can barely imagine living under such complete control. Relevant because the methods they used to achieve that control are still being refined and employed by modern systems of power. The techniques change, but the goal remains the same: turning human beings into willing components in systems that serve the interests of those at the top, while convincing everyone else that their suffering is necessary, natural, and noble. You wouldn't survive in the Aztec Empire not because you lack physical toughness or mental resilience, but because you still retain enough sense of individual worth, enough belief in personal freedom, enough resistance to authority to be recognizable as a threat to the system. Your inability to adapt to their world isn't a weakness. It's proof that some essential human qualities have survived despite centuries of attempts to eliminate them. But survival in that world would have required abandoning everything that makes you recognizably human in the modern sense. It would have meant accepting that your life belonged to others, that your thoughts should be controlled by priests, that your children existed to serve a system that viewed them as expendable resources. It would have meant participating enthusiastically in the torture and murder of innocent people while convincing yourself that you were serving a higher purpose. Some people, faced with such circumstances, might have found ways to adapt, to compartmentalize, to survive by becoming what the system demanded. But the psychological cost would have been enormous. You would have had to kill essential parts of yourself, to amputate your capacity for moral reasoning, to lobotomize your ability to imagine alternatives. You might have physically survived, but you wouldn't have remained the same person. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing lesson of the Aztec Empire. Not just that such systems can exist and thrive, but that they can successfully transform their victims into willing participants. That human beings, under sufficient pressure, can be conditioned to embrace their own degradation, to compete for the privilege of being exploited, to find meaning and purpose in systems designed to destroy everything that makes life worth living. The Aztecs didn't just build pyramids and develop calendars and create beautiful art. They built human beings. They took the raw material of human nature and shaped it into forms that served their purposes, eliminating inconvenient qualities like curiosity and compassion and independence, while enhancing useful traits like obedience and endurance, and the capacity to inflict suffering on others. They were, in their way, master psychologists and social engineers who understood human nature well enough to remake it according to their specifications. The society they created wasn't an accident or the result of primitive ignorance. It was a deliberate construction designed to achieve specific goals, and by their own standards, it was remarkably successful. That success is what makes it so terrifying to contemplate, because if human nature can be reshaped once, it can be reshaped again. If one civilization can create willing participants in systematic oppression, other civilizations can do the same. If the techniques worked in pre-Columbian Mexico, they can work anywhere, anytime, given sufficient time and ruthlessness and understanding of human psychology. The Aztec Empire is a reminder that the freedoms we enjoy, the dignity we claim, the rights we assert, aren't guaranteed by human nature or cosmic law. They're choices made by specific people in specific circumstances, defended by force and vigilance, and the constant refusal to accept that things must be the way they are. You wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire because you're the product of different choices, better choices, choices that recognized something sacred in individual human life that transcends the needs of states and systems and gods. But those choices aren't permanent. They can be unmade as easily as they were made. The only thing standing between us and new versions of the Aztec Empire is our willingness to remember what they created, to understand how they did it, and to refuse to let it happen again. That's the real lesson hidden in the blood-soaked stones of Tenochtitlan. But we're still not done exploring just how impossible survival would be in this empire, because we haven't even touched on the sheer physical brutality of daily existence, the environmental hazards that would kill modern people before they even understood what was happening to them. Let's talk about the water situation, because this gets genuinely terrifying when you dig into the details. Yes, the Aztecs had those famous aqueducts bringing fresh water from mountain springs, and yes, their engineering was impressive for its time. But here's what the history books don't emphasize enough. You're living on an island in the middle of a salt lake, surrounded by swampland, in a city of 300,000 people who are producing waste at a rate that would challenge modern sanitation systems. The fresh water coming through those aqueducts, it was distributed through clay pipes that cracked constantly, allowing contaminated lake water to seep in. The storage systems were open vessels where bacteria multiplied, where dead insects accumulated, where bird droppings dissolved into your drinking supply. And remember, this is a society with no understanding of germs, no concept of sterilization, no knowledge that invisible organisms could kill you just as effectively as an obsidian blade. Every sip of water was a gamble. Every meal washed down with lake-tainted liquid was another roll of the dice against dysentery, cholera, typhoid, or any number of waterborne diseases that could leave you writhing in agony, evacuating your bowels until you died of dehydration. Modern people get sick from accidentally swallowing pool water. Imagine drinking from a system where human waste was being transported through the same waterways that supplied your neighborhood. And the smell. Oh, the smell. We've talked about the burning flesh from the sacrificial temples, but that was just the most dramatic component of a citywide assault on your senses that would leave modern people retching within hours. The lake itself was becoming increasingly polluted as the population grew. Dead fish floated on the surface. Human excrement, despite the collection systems, still found its way into the water. The chinampas, those floating gardens, were fertilized with human waste, creating a permanent backdrop of decomposition and fermentation that hung over the city like a toxic cloud. Add to that the smoke from thousands of cooking fires, the stench of unwashed bodies pressed together in cramped living spaces, the odor of animals kept in close quarters with humans, and the ever-present smell of blood and death from the religious centers. Your modern nose, accustomed to air fresheners and soap and regular bathing, would be in constant revolt. You'd spend your days fighting nausea, trying to breathe through your mouth, desperately seeking any pocket of clean air that didn't exist. But let's get even more specific about the health challenges you'd face, because the diseases weren't just theoretical risks. They were daily realities that shaped every aspect of life in ways that would seem unbearable to modern sensibilities. Take parasites, for example, not the metaphorical kind we complain about in politics, but actual worms living in your intestines, feeding off your food, weakening your immune system, causing chronic pain and malnutrition that would slowly kill you over years of suffering. Intestinal parasites were virtually universal in Aztec society. The combination of poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close contact with animals created perfect conditions for every imaginable form of internal parasite. Roundworms that could grow to be feet long, coiled in your intestines like living rope. Tapeworms that could reach 20 feet in length, absorbing nutrients from your food until you starved despite eating. Hookworms that would bore through your skin and migrate to your lungs before settling in your small intestine to feed on your blood. The symptoms would be constant and debilitating. Chronic abdominal pain that never went away. Diarrhea that left you weak and dehydrated. Anemia from blood loss that made you dizzy and exhausted. Malnutrition despite adequate food intake because the parasites were consuming everything before your body could use it. And there was no treatment beyond herbal remedies that might occasionally expel some worms, but could never eliminate the constant reinfection that came from living in a contaminated environment. Modern people who get food poisoning from a questionable restaurant meal think they're dying after a few hours of discomfort. Imagine living with chronic parasitic infection for your entire life, never experiencing a day without pain, never having normal bowel movements, never feeling truly healthy or energetic. Your baseline existence would be what we'd consider severe illness, and that's just the internal parasites. External parasites were equally universal and equally miserable. Fleas, lice, mites, ticks, all thriving in the warm, humid climate and the crowded, unsanitary living conditions. Your scalp would be constantly itchy from lice bites. Your body would be covered in flea bites that became infected from scratching. Mites would burrow under your skin, creating painful sores that never healed properly. The itching would be constant and maddening. You'd scratch yourself raw, creating open wounds that became infected in the dirty environment. Sleep would be fitful and interrupted as you fought the urge to claw at your skin. Concentration would be impossible when every moment was consumed by the desperate need to scratch, and there was no relief, no treatment, no escape from the constant assault of creatures feeding on your blood and skin. But perhaps even more psychologically devastating than the physical discomfort would be the social isolation that came with visible signs of disease and infestation. In a society where appearance mattered enormously, where social status was constantly being evaluated and judged, looking sick or infested marked you as unclean, possibly cursed by the gods, certainly undesirable as a marriage partner or business associate. Skin conditions were particularly stigmatizing because they were so visible and so common. Fungal infections thrived in the humid climate and poor hygiene conditions. Bacterial infections turned minor cuts into spreading sores. Viral infections caused rashes and lesions that marked you as diseased. And with no understanding of contagion, people with visible symptoms were often blamed for their condition, accused of moral failings or spiritual corruption that had brought divine punishment upon them. The psychological impact of living with chronic illness and constant pain while being socially stigmatized for your condition would be crushing. Modern people struggle with depression and anxiety, even with access to medical treatment, social support, and the understanding that illness isn't a moral failing. Imagine dealing with severe physical symptoms while being told that your suffering was proof of your spiritual inadequacy, that the gods were punishing you for sins you might not even be aware of committing. And speaking of psychological pressure, let's talk about the noise. Modern people complain about traffic sounds and construction work, but Tenochtitlan was a cacophony of human and animal sounds that would drive sensitive modern ears to distraction. 300,000 people living in close quarters, talking, arguing, crying, laughing, shouting, thousands of dogs barking, flocks of birds kept for feathers, the constant splash of canoes in the canals, the rhythmic pounding of women grinding corn on stone metats, the scraping of tools on stone, the crackling of fires, the sound of construction work as buildings were constantly repaired and expanded. But underneath all the normal urban noise was something far more disturbing. The sounds of sacrifice, the screams of victims being tortured and killed, the chanting of priests, the drums and flutes that accompanied religious ceremonies, the cheering of crowds gathered to watch executions. These weren't occasional disturbances. They were daily background noise, a constant audio reminder that you lived in a society where human suffering was not just accepted, but celebrated. The psychological impact of hearing people being tortured to death on a regular basis would be devastating for anyone with normal human empathy. You'd develop a kind of auditory PTSD, jumping at unexpected sounds, unable to relax because your nervous system would be constantly alert to signs of danger. Sleep would be nearly impossible, with screams echoing across the city at all hours as religious ceremonies continued through the night. And you couldn't escape it by moving to a quieter neighborhood, because the entire city was organized around the temple complexes where the sacrifices took place. The screams would carry across the water, bouncing off the stone buildings, creating an acoustic environment where death was always audible, always present, always reminding you that your society's primary function was the systematic murder of human beings. But let's shift focus to something that might seem more mundane, but would actually be equally challenging for modern people. The food situation. We've talked about the tribute system and the economic pressure, but let's get specific about what you'd actually be eating and how it would affect your health and well-being. The Aztec diet was incredibly limited by modern standards. Corn, beans, squash, and chili peppers formed the foundations of most meals, supplemented occasionally with fish, insects, and small game. No wheat, no rice, no dairy products, no sugar except what came from fruits and agave. No coffee, no tea, no alcohol except for special occasions, and only for certain age groups. The variety that modern people take for granted simply didn't exist. But more challenging than the limited variety was the constant uncertainty about food quality and safety. Without refrigeration or reliable preservation methods, spoilage was a constant threat. Corn could develop toxic molds that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Fish from the polluted lake could carry parasites and bacterial infections, Meat, when available, had to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking and drying processes that didn't always work effectively. Every meal was a calculated risk. Eat the corn that smells slightly off because you're hungry, or go without food and weaken yourself for tomorrow's labor. Consume the fish that looks questionable because it's your only source of protein, or stick to plants and risk malnutrition. These weren't theoretical dilemmas. They were daily decisions that could mean the difference between health and illness, strength and weakness, life and death. The preparation of food was also fraught with dangers that modern people never consider. Grinding corn on stone metats introduced grit and stone particles into the food, gradually wearing down teeth and causing dental problems that could become life-threatening infections. Cooking over open fires created constant risks of burns, smoke inhalation, and accidental poisoning from toxic plants used as fuel. Storage in clay vessels that could crack and allow contamination meant that even properly prepared food could become dangerous between preparation and consumption, and the nutritional deficiencies would be severe and constant. The limited diet meant chronic shortages of essential vitamins and minerals, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from insufficient vitamin D, anemia from iron deficiency. These weren't rare diseases affecting a few unlucky individuals. They were endemic conditions that weakened the entire population, making everyone more susceptible to infections, injuries, and other health problems. The psychological impact of chronic malnutrition would be as devastating as the physical effects. Constant hunger, even when food was available, because the available food wasn't nutritionally adequate. Difficulty concentrating because your brain wasn't getting the nutrients it needed to function properly. Mood swings and depression caused by blood sugar fluctuations and nutrient deficiencies. Reduced cognitive function that made learning and problem solving more difficult. Modern people who skip a meal or two feel irritable and unfocused. Imagine living your entire life in a state of mild to moderate malnutrition, never experiencing the mental clarity and emotional stability that comes from adequate nutrition. Your personality, your intelligence, your emotional resilience would all be compromised by the simple fact that your brain wasn't getting the fuel it needed to operate at full capacity. But even if you could somehow adapt to the limited diet and nutritional deficiencies, you'd still face the challenge of food acquisition in a society where every scrap was precious and competition was fierce. The markets where food was sold weren't cheerful community gatherings like modern farmers' markets. They were desperate scrambles where the poor competed for scraps while the wealthy purchased the best items, leaving everyone else to fight over what remained. Prices fluctuated wildly based on weather, political conditions, and the success or failure of tribute collections from distant provinces. A bad harvest could double or triple the cost of basic staples overnight. A military campaign could disrupt trade routes and leave entire neighborhoods without access to essential foods. Political tensions could cut off supplies from particular regions, creating artificial shortages that drove prices beyond what common families could afford. The emotional toll of food insecurity would be constant and overwhelming. Parents would go hungry to feed their children, knowing that weakened adults meant reduced capacity for the labor needed to earn tomorrow's food. Children would learn early that every grain of corn was precious, that waste was not just discouraged, but potentially fatal, that the difference between eating and starving often came down to luck, weather, and political decisions made by people who would never know their names. And underlying all of this daily struggle for physical survival was the constant awareness that your society's resources were being systematically diverted to support activities that produced nothing useful. The elaborate temple complexes required enormous amounts of food to feed the priests and support staff. The sacrificial ceremonies consumed resources that could have been used to improve agriculture or develop better food preservation techniques. The military campaigns designed to capture sacrifice victims diverted labor and materials from productive activities. You'd be struggling to feed your family while watching enormous quantities of food being used to support institutions whose primary function was killing people. The cognitive dissonance would be maddening. Working yourself to exhaustion to produce food that would be consumed by priests whose job was organizing mass murder, watching your children go hungry while elaborate feasts were held to celebrate successful human sacrifices. The waste would be particularly galling to anyone with modern sensibilities about efficiency and resource allocation. Enormous amounts of perfectly good food would be ritually destroyed as offerings to gods who, if they existed at all, clearly had no need for physical sustenance. Valuable agricultural products would be burned, buried, or thrown into the lake as part of religious ceremonies, while actual people went hungry just blocks away from the temples. But perhaps most psychologically devastating would be the realization that this wasn't a temporary crisis or a result of poor planning. This was the system working exactly as designed. The food insecurity, the constant struggle, the waste of resources on religious activities, all of this was intentional. It served the interests of the ruling class by keeping the population too weak and desperate to organize resistance, too focused on daily survival to question the fundamental structure of society. You'd gradually understand that your hunger, your family's malnutrition, your constant anxiety about where the next meal would come from weren't unfortunate side effects of a difficult situation. They were deliberate features of a system designed to maintain control through manufactured scarcity. The empire had the resources to feed everyone adequately, but chose instead to concentrate wealth and food security among the elite, while keeping everyone else in a state of chronic deprivation. This realization would be crushing for anyone with modern expectations about social responsibility and efficient resource allocation. We're accustomed to thinking that governments exist to serve their people, that social systems should be designed to maximize general welfare, that waste and inefficiency are problems to be solved, rather than tools of control. Learning that your society was deliberately structured to create suffering would destroy any remaining faith in the possibility of justice or improvement, and there would be no escape through individual effort or merit. Unlike modern societies, where hard work and intelligence can sometimes overcome disadvantaged circumstances, Aztec society was designed to prevent upward mobility. The tribute system, the rigid social hierarchy, the controlled access to resources, all work together to ensure that birth determined destiny and that no amount of personal effort could change your fundamental circumstances. You could work harder than anyone else in your neighborhood, develop better techniques for growing crops, or making crafts, demonstrate superior intelligence and leadership abilities, and still remain trapped in the same grinding poverty as your parents and grandparents. Excellence was irrelevant when the system was designed to extract maximum value from workers while providing them with minimum resources for survival. The psychological impact of realizing that merit didn't matter, that effort wasn't rewarded, that intelligence and creativity were wasted in a system that valued only obedience and productivity, would be devastating for anyone raised with modern expectations about fairness and opportunity. You'd be forced to choose between accepting your predetermined fate or driving yourself mad with the futile pursuit of impossible dreams. And the final insult would be the constant propaganda telling you that this was all for your own good, that the gods had designed society this way for cosmic reasons beyond human understanding, that your suffering was necessary and noble and spiritually beneficial. You'd be expected not just to endure your circumstances, but to be grateful for them, to celebrate the very system that was grinding you down, to participate enthusiastically in religious ceremonies that justified and perpetuated your oppression. The complete inversion of moral values would be particularly disturbing for modern people accustomed to thinking that suffering should be minimized, that individual dignity should be respected, that social systems should serve human needs rather than the other way around. In Aztec society, suffering was good, individual desires were selfish, and human needs were secondary to cosmic obligations that conveniently aligned with the interests of those in power. You'd be living in a world where everything you'd been taught about right and wrong was turned upside down, where the virtues you'd been raised to value were considered vices, where the behaviors you'd been taught to condemn were celebrated as the highest forms of religious devotion. The moral disorientation would be as debilitating as any physical hardship, leaving you uncertain about basic questions of right and wrong, good and evil, worth and worthlessness. This is why survival in the Aztec Empire would be impossible for modern people, not just because of the physical challenges, though those would be overwhelming, not just because of the social restrictions, though those would be suffocating, but because the entire moral and psychological framework that makes life meaningful for modern people would be systematically destroyed and replaced with values so alien and disturbing that accepting them would require abandoning everything that makes you recognizably human. The Aztecs didn't just control bodies and behaviors, they controlled minds and souls, creating human beings who genuinely believed that their suffering was sacred, that their oppression was cosmic necessity, that their society's appetite for blood and death was the highest expression of divine will. They succeeded in ways that modern totalitarian regimes can only dream of, creating not just compliance, but enthusiastic participation in systems of organized cruelty. Understanding this helps explain not just why you wouldn't survive in their world, but why their world eventually collapsed when confronted with alternatives. The Spanish conquest wasn't just a military victory, it was the collision between two completely different ways of understanding human nature and social organization. And while the Spanish were hardly paragons of virtue, their society at least allowed for some recognition of individual worth, some possibility of questioning authority, some concept of universal human dignity. The Aztec Empire, for all its achievements in art and architecture and urban planning, had eliminated these possibilities so completely that when their system faced external pressure, it had no internal resources for adaptation or renewal. They had created human beings so thoroughly conditioned to obedience that when the chain of command broke down, the entire civilization collapsed like a house of cards. That collapse wasn't a tragedy in the conventional sense. It was the inevitable result of building a society on foundations so fundamentally inhuman that they couldn't survive contact with even slightly more humane alternatives. The Aztecs had achieved something remarkable and terrible. They had perfected human subjugation to a degree that made their civilization simultaneously magnificent and monstrous, successful and ultimately doomed. You wouldn't last a day in their empire because you're the product of centuries of slow, painful progress toward recognizing that human beings have inherent worth, that suffering should be minimized rather than celebrated, that social systems should serve people rather than the other way around. These aren't universal truths or natural laws. They're hard-won achievements that required countless people to resist, to question, to sacrifice, to insist that there had to be better ways of organizing human societies. The Aztec Empire reminds us how fragile these achievements are, how easily they can be lost, how quickly human beings can be conditioned to accept and even celebrate their own degradation. It shows us possibilities we'd rather not contemplate and warns us about the eternal human temptation to sacrifice individual dignity for collective power, to trade freedom for security, to accept oppression in exchange for the promise of meaning and purpose. But it also shows us why the struggle for human dignity and freedom is worth continuing, why the values we've inherited from centuries of moral progress are worth defending, why the question of how human beings should treat each other remains the most important question any society can ask, because the alternative isn't just different, it's the systematic transformation of human beings into instruments of power and objects of sacrifice. And once that transformation is complete, there's no easy way back. The most haunting aspect of all this isn't just the individual suffering, though that would be unbearable enough. It's the systematic way the Aztec Empire turned human compassion itself into a weapon of control. Because even as you watched your neighbors disappear into the sacrificial temples, even as you heard the screams echoing across the city, even as you smelled the smoke from burning hearts, you'd be expected to celebrate, to cheer, to participate in the very rituals that could claim your own life tomorrow. This wasn't accidental cruelty or the byproduct of primitive ignorance. This was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to break down the basic human bonds that might otherwise lead to resistance. When everyone is complicit in everyone else's potential murder, trust becomes impossible. When participation in atrocity is mandatory, moral clarity disappears. When the victims of today become the celebrants of tomorrow's executions, solidarity crumbles into isolated terror. The genius of the system was how it made resistance not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. Because resisting the sacrificial system meant resisting the gods themselves. And resisting the gods meant condemning not just yourself, but your entire family, your entire neighborhood, possibly your entire city to divine retribution. The psychological pressure to conform wasn't just social, it was cosmic. The entire universe, according to Aztec cosmology, depended on human sacrifice. Without it, the sun would stop rising, The rains would stop falling. The world itself would end in apocalyptic darkness. So when you watched a priest tear the beating heart from someone's chest, you weren't just witnessing murder, you were watching the universe being saved. When you heard the screams of flaying victims, you weren't listening to torture, you were hearing the prayers that kept reality intact. When you smelled the smoke of burning human flesh, you weren't inhaling death. You were breathing the incense that maintained cosmic order. The complete inversion of moral reality would shatter any modern person's ability to function psychologically. We're trained from childhood to recognize suffering as bad, to feel empathy for victims, to be disturbed by violence and cruelty. In the Aztec Empire, these natural human responses were systematically rewired until compassion became blasphemy, empathy became weakness, and moral revulsion became evidence of spiritual corruption. Children grew up learning that the highest virtue was the willingness to inflict suffering on others in service of divine will. They played games that mimicked sacrifice rituals. They were taught songs celebrating the beauty of flowing blood. They learned to associate the smell of burning flesh with religious devotion and cosmic responsibility. By adulthood, their moral instincts had been so thoroughly corrupted that they could watch torture and murder while feeling not horror, but spiritual fulfillment. This is what makes the Aztec Empire uniquely terrifying among history's many brutal civilizations. Other societies have practiced human sacrifice, imposed rigid hierarchies, demanded absolute obedience, but few have achieved such complete psychological transformation of their populations. The Aztecs didn't just force people to participate in atrocities. They convinced them that atrocity was virtue, that cruelty was kindness, that murder was the highest form of love. Living in such an environment would require abandoning not just your modern sensibilities, but your basic humanity. You'd have to learn to feel joy at the sight of suffering, to find meaning in meaningless death, to worship gods whose primary attribute was an insatiable appetite for human agony. You'd have to become something fundamentally different from what you are now, something that could look at a pyramid built from human skulls and see not horror but beauty, not waste but wisdom, not evil but the very foundation of cosmic order. And the most disturbing part is that it would work. Given enough time, enough pressure, enough systematic conditioning, you would adapt. You would learn to celebrate sacrifice, to find spiritual fulfillment in ritual murder, to see compassion as weakness and cruelty as strength. You would become what the system needed you to become, and you would do it willingly, even enthusiastically, because the alternative would be madness or death. But in becoming what the system required, you would cease to be you in any meaningful sense. The person who learned to cheer at executions, to find beauty in torture, to worship through inflicting suffering, would share your body and perhaps your memories, but they wouldn't share your soul. They would be what the Aztec Empire had made them, a human-shaped component in a vast machine designed to transform living people into offerings for hungry gods. This is the final lesson of the Aztec Empire, the one that makes it impossible for modern people to survive there intact. Not that the physical conditions would kill you, though they would. Not that the social restrictions would crush you, though they would, but that the psychological transformation required for survival would destroy everything that makes you who you are. You could live in their world, but only by dying as yourself and being reborn as something alien and terrible. The Aztecs succeeded where other totalitarian systems have failed because they understood that true control requires not just obedience, but transformation. They didn't just want their subjects to follow orders, they wanted them to become the kind of people who would give those orders willingly, who would find fulfillment in cruelty, who would see suffering as sacred and death as divine gift. And they achieved this transformation not through crude brutality alone, though there was plenty of that, but through sophisticated manipulation of human psychology, human spirituality, human need for meaning and purpose. They offered their subjects something that modern secular societies often struggle to provide: absolute certainty about the meaning of existence, complete clarity about moral obligation, total assurance that their lives served a cosmic purpose. The price of that certainty was everything we consider essentially human. But for people born into the system, raised within its logic, shaped by its values from their earliest moments, the price seemed not just acceptable, but necessary. They weren't being asked to sacrifice their humanity. They were being taught that humanity itself was the sacrifice the universe required. This is why you wouldn't last a day in the Aztec Empire. Not because you lack courage or strength or intelligence, but because you retain enough human decency to be destroyed by what you'd be required to become. Your inability to adapt isn't a failure. It's proof that some essential human qualities have survived centuries of attempts to eliminate them, that the values we've inherited from generations of moral progress aren't just cultural preferences, but something deeper and more precious. The Aztec Empire stands as both warning and reminder. Warning of what human societies can become when power is unchecked and conscience is systematically destroyed. Reminder of why the freedoms we take for granted, the rights we assume are natural, the dignity we believe is inherent, are actually fragile achievements that require constant defense against forces that would reduce human beings to raw material for the ambitions of those who claim to speak for gods, or history, or cosmic necessity. In the end, you wouldn't survive in the Aztec Empire because you're still human in ways that their system was designed to eliminate. And perhaps that's the most important thing to remember as we face our own challenges, our own temptations to trade freedom for security, individual dignity for collective purpose, human compassion for ideological purity. The Aztecs built one of history's most successful civilizations by perfecting the art of turning people into things. We've inherited something better, something harder to maintain, but infinitely more valuable. The question is whether we're wise enough to keep it.